What if everything you've been told about needing more soil and more space to grow healthy vegetables was actually working against you? More soil, more space, more room for roots to spread. It sounds logical. But could a few vegetables in pots really grow faster, produce cleaner harvests, suffer fewer diseases, and even outproduce anything grown in the ground? Surprisingly, yes, some vegetables actually perform better in containers. So, what exactly does a simple container give you that open ground never can? Control, better drainage, better soil quality, fewer weeds, fewer pests, and the ability to move plants exactly where they need to be. Whether that's a sprawling backyard or just a single sunny corner of an apartment balcony. So which 7 more vegetables actually perform better in a pot than they ever could in your garden bed? Stay until the end, because the final plant on this list is so perfectly suited for containers that many gardeners never grow it in garden beds at all. Let's get started. Starting things off at number 7. Peppers. Someone who's actually grown peppers, cherry tomatoes, and lettuce together in containers described the results as nothing short of incredible. Cleaner harvests, and far fewer pests than they expected from any of the 3. That tracks with what's actually happening underground with peppers specifically. Pepper plants enjoy having their roots slightly restricted, which sounds like a disadvantage, until you understand what it actually does. In a spacious garden bed, a pepper plant sometimes pours far too much of its energy into leafy growth instead of fruit, ending up bushy and green, with disappointingly little to show for it. A container creates just enough restriction to redirect that energy toward peppers instead of oversized foliage. There's a warmth advantage layered on top of that too. Peppers love heat, and containers warm up considerably faster than garden soil, which translates into faster growth, earlier flowering, and heavier production, especially in cooler climates where in-ground peppers tend to lag behind all season. Drainage improves the picture even further. Wet feet stunt growth and raise the risk of disease. A good potting mix solves that almost entirely by letting excess water move through instead of pooling around the roots. Because the pot can move, you also get to chase better sunlight throughout the day. Tuck the plant away before a storm rolls in, or reposition it entirely as the seasons shift. Put all of that together, and even a medium-sized container, sitting on a patio or a balcony, can turn out dozens of peppers in a single season, with surprisingly little upkeep from week to week. Proof that better vegetables don't actually come from a bigger garden. They come from better conditions in a smaller, more carefully controlled one. Moving up to number 6. Cucumbers. If you've ever wondered whether your cucumber container is actually big enough, you're asking exactly the right question. Cucumbers usually struggle in a garden bed because poor airflow around the leaves creates the perfect setup for mildew and fungal disease. Growing them vertically on a trellis inside a container fixes most of that immediately. Air moves freely around the leaves, and disease pressure drops. But the trellis alone isn't the whole story. Cucumber roots need real depth to grow into, not just a tall structure to climb. A shallow or undersized pot can still leave the plant stressed, even with a perfect trellis set up beside it. So giving the roots enough room below the soil matters just as much as giving the vine somewhere to climb. Get that right, and the rest falls into place. Instead of sprawling across the ground, the vine grows upward, which suits a patio or a compact backyard perfectly. Harvesting gets easier too, since the fruit hangs in plain sight instead of hiding under tangled leaves. Cucumbers, resting on bare soil, often rot or pick up pest damage, while an elevated vine keeps the fruit clean and healthy. Containers also warm earlier in spring for faster establishment. And because watering can be controlled more precisely, the plant avoids the stress that comes from unpredictable soil moisture. A single healthy plant, given the right depth, a sturdy trellis, and good sun, can turn out far more food than most people expect. At number 5. Eggplant. Eggplant has a clear preference for warm soil, and that preference alone explains why it so often performs better in a pot than it ever does in the ground. Garden beds warm slowly in spring, especially in cooler climates, while a container heats up much faster, giving the plant exactly the warm root zone it craves from the very start. That extra warmth translates into faster growth, earlier flowering, and often a noticeably heavier harvest by the time summer winds down. Drainage matters just as much here. Eggplant genuinely hates soggy soil, and a container gives far more control over moisture levels, which keeps the roots healthy and the whole plant more productive as a result. There's also a real flexibility advantage worth pointing out. Eggplant needs full sun to really perform, and a container can be repositioned throughout the season to chase the best light available, something a fixed garden bed simply has no way of offering. On top of all of that, eggplant happens to be surprisingly decorative. The purple flowers and glossy fruit make it a strong fit for a patio or any container garden meant to look as good as it produces. And despite that elegant appearance, it's far tougher than most people assume. Once established, it shrugs off summer heat without complaint and keeps producing steadily through even the hottest stretch of the season, sometimes rewarding a single plant with harvest after harvest for months on end. It's one more case proving that a smaller, well-managed space can genuinely outperform a sprawling traditional garden. Breaking into the top 4, cherry tomatoes. A lot of gardeners give up on the idea of tomatoes in containers entirely because large slicing varieties so rarely seem to work out the way they hoped. Cherry tomatoes flip that story completely, and quite a few varieties actually perform better in a pot than they ever would in the ground. Part of that comes down to disease control. Garden beds expose tomatoes to soil-borne fungi, splashing rain, and uneven drainage. And all three of those factors raise disease pressure as a season wears on. A container creates a far more controlled environment instead. Better drainage keeps the roots healthy, and elevated growth improves airflow around the leaves, which matters a great deal, since tomatoes are especially vulnerable to fungal problems whenever conditions turn humid. Cherry tomatoes also produce noticeably smaller fruit than giant beefsteak varieties, which puts far less strain on a container's root system and lets the plant focus its energy on continuous production instead of struggling to support oversized fruit it was never built to carry. A single, healthy plant can turn out hundreds of small tomatoes over the course of a season, and because the fruit ripens gradually, rather than all at once, harvesting becomes an ongoing reward you return to again and again, instead of one overwhelming event. A simple cage or stake tucked inside the pot keeps everything upright without eating into valuable space elsewhere. On a balcony, a patio, or a small suburban yard, cherry tomatoes often end up becoming one of the most productive crops grown all year long. And once someone experiences how easy and how genuinely rewarding that is, going back to large tomatoes in a traditional garden bed rarely feels worth the trouble again. If these tips are helping you get more out of less space, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Every week, we share simple, practical ways to grow more food without needing more land. Now, if cherry tomatoes prove that hundreds of small rewards can beat one giant harvest, the next crop proves the same thing works just as well, without any fruit at all. At number 3, bush beans. Bush beans already carry a reputation for being easy to grow, and a container only makes them more efficient still. Unlike pole beans, they stay compact and never demand a tall trellis or any complicated support structure, so they quietly fill a pot with flowers and then pods in surprisingly little time. Warmth speeds things along too. Bush beans germinate and establish faster in warm soil, and a container heats up far quicker than a garden bed does in spring, which usually means earlier growth and an earlier harvest waiting for you. There's a cleanliness benefit worth mentioning as well. Pods that hang above the container stay noticeably cleaner and easier to pick than beans tangled in muddy ground after a rainstorm. And weed control improves dramatically too, which matters most during those early weeks, when bush beans strongly dislike competing for root space with anything else nearby. Even a single corner of a balcony is genuinely enough room for a few pots of these. Because the plants grow in dense little clusters, even one medium container can produce a genuinely impressive harvest from a surprisingly small footprint. Enough that some gardeners are honestly shocked by how many meals they end up pulling from just a few pots over a season. It's the kind of crop that takes almost all the guesswork out of growing your own food, while still putting something real on the table every week. Closing in on the top 2, mint. Most gardeners don't actually struggle to grow mint at all. They struggle to stop it once it gets going. In a garden bed, mint spreads aggressively through underground runners, invading nearby space and crowding out almost anything planted near it. What starts as one small patch can quietly take over an entire yard within a season or two. A container solves that the moment you plant it, giving mint its own contained space to grow freely, without causing chaos anywhere else in the garden. Once it has that space, it asks for almost nothing in return. It grows fast, bounces back quickly after a hard cut, and tolerates being ignored for a stretch far better than most herbs ever could. A pot near the kitchen door keeps it within easy reach for tea, desserts, salads, drinks, or sauces. And because containers drain better than overly wet garden soil, the roots tend to stay noticeably healthier too. Even a small pot tucked onto a balcony is enough to keep a steady supply going year-round, without much thought. The slightly warmer soil inside a container also helps it keep growing through the cooler stretches of the season, when in-ground mint would otherwise slow down. What surprises a lot of gardeners eventually is that containing mint doesn't hold it back at all. It actually grows better the moment you take away its room to compete with anything else nearby, which is exactly why so many experienced growers refuse to plant it straight into the ground ever again. And finally, taking the #1 spot, basil. If there's one plant that feels purpose-built for container life, this is it. Garden beds often hold far too much moisture around the roots after heavy rain, and basil genuinely hates that. Wet feet quickly lead to stress, disease, and weak, leggy growth that never quite recovers. A container solves the problem right away, with better drainage and soil that warms up faster than the ground ever does. Warm roots make basil genuinely thrive, and a happy basil plant becomes remarkably, almost surprisingly, productive. Good airflow plays a role here too, cutting down on fungal issues, while encouraging healthier leaf growth throughout the entire season. It's also one of the easiest herbs to actually put to use day to day. A pot near the kitchen puts fresh leaves within reach for pasta, salads, sandwiches, pizza, sauces, and nearly anything else you might be cooking that night. The more you harvest it, the bushier and more productive it tends to become. So a single healthy plant can keep producing fresh leaves for months without slowing down. Because the container can move, you can chase the best sunlight throughout the day, or pull it out of harm's way before a storm rolls in. And that flexibility only strengthens the plant further over time. Unlike sprawling garden crops that demand real space to perform, basil stays compact while still delivering non-stop rewards all season long. Proof that a container doesn't limit what a plant is capable of. Sometimes, that's exactly when it does its best work, because successful gardening isn't always about having more space. Sometimes, it's simply about using the space you already have, more intelligently than you have been. So, counting back from 7, peppers, cucumbers, eggplant, cherry tomatoes, bush beans, mint, and basil. 7 more vegetables that often do better tucked into a pot than they ever would planted out in the ground. If this list just saved you from chasing a bigger yard you don't actually need, drop a comment below and let us know which one of these you're planning to try first.